Hello, all. Welcome to the December 13th Gaming Club. So today I wanted to talk about the 9 generations of gaming, of game consoles. So starting way back in 1972 is when the first consoles came into place. They were usually like Pong consoles. Their controllers were usually either built into the system themselves, or they were very chunky controllers that use basically left just two dials. That they're very basic consoles. They usually just play Pong or something very simplistic. And then moving on to the second generation, 76, these became a little bit more sophisticated. They usually added joysticks, buttons. They kind of exploded. And if the weird thing about these first two generations, in fact, that we don't have accurate records of a lot of the consoles that were generated, because console gaming was so new at the time that basically everybody was jumping on the bandwagon. Everyone was trying their own technology with it. It was a lot. And then starting with the third generation, it started to get a little bit more organized, a little bit more consistent. This is when Nintendo first put out their first console, the NES, and Atari started putting out consoles of themselves. And then the fourth generation came along in '87, where they have the NES, the Sega Jaguar. Those kind of consoles get more and more complicated. The fifth generation came the first one with PlayStation after breaking off from Nintendo, and the sixth generation coming in with Nintendo and Sony, but also Xbox starting to throw their hat into the ring. And then we know the seventh generation being the Xbox 360, the PS3, and the Wii. The eighth generation is the PS4, the Xbox One and One S, and the Nintendo Switch. Technically, there was one more Nintendo console. The Wii U was technically the eighth generation, but Nintendo kind of wants to sweep that under the rug. And then finally, we're in the ninth generation, which only has the Xbox Series X and S and the PS5. Nintendo has not put a console out this generation, but they seem to be going very strong with their Switch, which I feel is kind of just a bridge, kind of a bridging console between the eighth and ninth generation for them. They may put something out later on in the years, given the fact that we're only 3-4 years into the generation. So they could definitely put another console out before too long. So, kind of looking at the timeline of stuff, you can, I was, the first generation that I was technically alive for was the sixth generation, with the GameCube, the original Xbox, and the PS2. Everything else came before me. You can kind of see like where the timeline shift and kind of see where you kind of like where you started with gaming, where gaming was when you started looking into it. So kind of going into the different graphics of each of the 9 generations. We started the first generation being basically black and white, very simplistic graphics, just showing the bare minimum of sprites and what was available. Moving to the second generation, they started out a little bit of color, a little bit more movement, and made a little bit more of like the gaming we know today. By the third generation, we added not only more pixels, more sprites, but added more color in general. Fourth generation added even more detail, even more sprites, even more color. Fifth generation, we're starting to get the fourth generation dipped into 3D. It was the fifth generation that really went full force into 3D and showing showing the expanse that console can actually show. And the sixth generation came along, got more realistic 3D, more photorealistic stuff. Fifth generation came along, even more detail. Eighth generation, even more detail. And by the ninth generation, we are seeing very lifelike or as close to lifelike as we currently have for graphics. And the big shift in the last couple of generations is more away from like how detailed something is and how quickly it can load up and how quickly it can show changes. So, but if you kind of look at the 9 generations, there's one big difference, one big kind of shift you can see in all this. And that's kind of based on this idea that the diminishing returns in polygons. You see, every, each of the 4 busts there have 10 times as many triangles, 10 times as many detail edges as the previous one. But you can see that as we progress, there's less differences between them. And that's kind of been the struggle last couple of years for game designers, is kind of trying to show the public something else besides graphics. Because it used to be, they show more detailed graphics, but at the point that while it is still more graphically detailed, it's less noticeable. I'll show you an example really quick. From the 1st generation to the 3rd generation, we see not only is there addition of color, there's much more detail in sprites, much more detail in what is on screen. And this is a 20-year gap. We go to the 7th generation to the 9th generation. This is slightly lower. It's a 15-year gap. But there is very little detailed difference between the two, or at least there's less detailed difference between the 1st and the 3rd, and the 7th and the 9th. That's kind of the idea of what this is talking about. The fact that game designers had to shift away from advertising higher detail for their consoles or their games. Rather, they have to shift more towards, loading speeds or rendering times, or how many calculations can be happened, how realistic like simulations are. Water, the big thing nowadays is like how realistic water, hair, stuff like that. Think like little differences that require a bunch of computing power can do. So that's one of the struggles of it is the change in diminishing returns from graphics. So, but to make all these graphics happen, we have to look at the console hardware. So, real quick, I'm going to talk about 4 main things that change between each one. We're talking about the media, which is what the games came on. Like if you bought a game, what would the game be? And we talk about the GPU and the CPU. The CPU is just the brain of a console. It's the thing that figures out what's going on screen, what your inputs mean, and how that all mixes together. The GPU is a little bit different. It's a separate brain that all it does is it makes sure that the image we're seeing is more clear, and that it has more detail. So the CPU can do all that, but if you add a GPU, it takes not only that effort off of the CPU so you can focus on just regular calculations, but it also has a dedicated area to do graphics details and graphics display. And then finally, we talk about the memory, which is how much the console can remember and calculate on. So the more memory it has, the more stuff it can calculate and figure out at one point. To start with the 1st generation, they were just custom circuit boards. It's the same idea as today's plug and play consoles. There was no game card. There was no cartridge you put in. It was just a single built system that you just played one game on. If you wanted a different game, you'd have to completely change out the circuit board. And there was no GPU and there was no memory. It was just transistor logic. And transistor logic is literally just on or off. All it knows is it has a screen, and it just knows if there's something here, it's the pixels on. If it's not there, it's pixels off. That's all it knows. That's why the first generation was just black and white. That's all it could do. It could just do on or off. Went to the second generation, they started introducing cartridges, which, introducing cartridges, which were basically separate memory cards in, usually encased in plastic. They just put into the console they could read and figure out. There still wasn't a GPU at this time, but the CPU came into effect where it had 1 to 2 megahertz, which means every second it could do 1 to 2 calculations, and it had very minute memory. But at the time, it didn't need a lot of memory because it wasn't really, all it needed to remember was what is exactly on its screen. It didn't need to figure out anything else. And so the third generation came along. There still was no GPU. It was still these cartridges, but they were able to do twice as many calculations, went from 1 to 2 to 2 to 4 calculations a second, and they had just about a third to just about 1.5 to 2 times as much RAM. It was a little bit of a jump, but the third generation's big difference over the second we'll talk about a little bit later, because there was a big change. It just in the hardware there wasn't that much of a difference. We went to the fourth generation. We still have the cartridge with no GPU, but the CPU can suddenly do even more. Went from 8 bits to 16 bits, and I will talk about the bits in a second, because I want you to understand kind of a little bit more about this. Fifth generation came along. They introduced disk-based games. This was when the PlayStation was first brought into effect, and PlayStation brought into effect the Sega CD, stuff like that, and they saw the new avenue that disc could create, and you kind of see the big jump between the bits. We went from 8 to 16 bits all the way up to 32 and sometimes 64 bits. And that was primarily where disc had its advantage. It had a lot more memory a lot more storage, a lot more memory that it could contain and have a lot more detail. They have 12 to 100 calculations a second, and with jumping up from 0.008 all the way up to 2 and 4.5. That big jump between the memory and the CPU was a big change between the fourth and the fifth generation. When sixth generation came along, they got rid of all cartridges. It was just disk based. They finally were able to introduce a CPU, and that's where we see kind of a change between the graphics between the fifth and the sixth generation, because they suddenly have the GPU that handles the graphics and the images, while the CPU just has to handle all the actual calculations. And GPU is a little bit different from CPU, as the megahertz is actually technically doubled, because you're going to be thinking, because it has to check it. If something comes in, it checks the image, it sends it back to the CPU, because it gets it back and checks it again. So it's actually checking things twice every second. So it's at 100 to 233 megahertz. It's technically doing 200 to 466 calculations a second. And we see even bigger jump from the 12 to 100 megahertz in the CPU all the way up to 200 and 700 megahertz. And we have even a bigger jump for the RAM. In the seventh generation, we even increases everything even more. Eighth generation, even more. And you see the cartridges came back because of the switch, but the cartridges were a little bit different. Instead of being basically another chip that the console has to integrate, Switch games are more of basically a flash drive. It can just read the game data right off of it, rather than having to run more calculations through the system, through the cartridge itself. So that's why the Switch cartridge can still run better games compared to like the first 4 4 or 5 generations because those cartridges aren't the same as older cartridges. And finally, we're in the ninth generation, which has ridiculous amounts of numbers and calculations that it can run. And this is why current consoles can run such photorealistic and intricate games. Is because it has the ability to calculate this much stuff. Now, I said I talked about the bits and what a bit is. I say 8-bit, 16-bit, 32, 64-bit. All it's saying is that that for every spot, every pixel on a screen, there is 8 on or off switches that can be shifted. A bit is an on or off switch. So the number of bits is how many on or off switches each section gets. So the time put in calculations, 8 bits, there's for an 8-bit console, every pixel, every section has 256 different values it can have. 16-bit goes to 65,000 differences. Then it goes to 32-bit, which has 429 billion different values. And finally, we have the 64-bit, which has kind of been the standard since about the 5th generation. And we have 18 quintillion different values that each section can have. And those different values can be color, shade, properties. It can be anything. That's why there's such a big difference between the graphics as we continue on, because they've been able to harness this ability to see different textures, different colors, different everything within each bit. Okay, so finally, if we're going to talk about consoles, we have to talk about the inevitable crash of '83. Now, the timing of the crash is pretty significant because the first generation of console started in '72. So there's only about a 10-year gap between when video games first started, when there was a big market crash because of them. There's a huge reason for this. It's because it was such a new technology and a new thing that can be accessed. A lot of companies were jumping on the bandwagon to try and throw their hat into the ring to try and get a piece of that video game stock. So there was a lot of console. That's why I'm saying the first few generations we don't have accurate records of stuff, because there were so many consoles that were created that we don't have an accurate record of what was actually put out there and by what companies. So because there were so many companies putting game consoles out, there was also, there were some good consoles, but then there was a lot of bad consoles. A lot of consoles that were just thrown together quickly just to make a quick profit. And also at the time, personal computers were also starting to come into effect, and they were used a lot more for gaming as well. And so there was a shift from console gaming to PC gaming, because PCs can be upgraded and there's a lot more standardization across PCs compared to the consoles. Now, from '82 to '83, analysts showed that there was twice as much demand for console gaming, which means like from which basically just means that consumers are wanting games. However, during that same time from '82 to '83, companies were putting out 3 times as much product. So while consumers did want more product, they didn't want this much product. And so this led to a lack of confidence from consumers and retailers. And not only was consumers getting kind of iffy to bad quality consoles and games, retailers were getting stockpiles of stuff because they didn't have space to put all these different consoles and games on display. And a lot of them tried to send them back. And after you hold on to merchandise for so long, you can try to send it back and get store credits so that you don't lose profit on it. Problem was, some of these game consoles weren't selling almost at all, and so not only were the companies already overstocked with their own consoles, they didn't have any money to send back to them as a refund. So a lot of the retailers just had to drastically mark everything down. Games at the time were sold for like the equivalent of $99 today. They were marked down to $14 because they just needed to get rid of it. They didn't want it in their store anymore. And kind of a good example of what all this means is that in '83, the home video game stock was valued at $3.2 billion. But within 2 years, it had dropped to only $100 million. This means that within those 2 years, there was a 96.9% drop in stock value just surrounding console video games. And so there was just this large bubble of mistrust and uncertainty about console gaming because there was such an oversaturation of consoles at the time. And so it was, finally, the Nintendo was able to revitalize the market through the Famicom or an NES in '85 because they saw what happened in the past. They saw the company was just reducing stuff as quickly as possible and not having quality. So they came into the picture and were like, okay, we will get quality products at a decent price that people will be more confident in. And that's why the NES is still such a popular console, is because not only is it a solid console still, it helped revitalize the home console market. So that is kind of the evolution of gaming consoles, kind of where things have shifted from the very start to where we are now. So console generations is fascinating. To me, anything like all like evolution of computers are fascinating to me because it's amazing to see how computing in general has magnified and how technology has become so commonplace that we as consumers have access to this kind of information. Because you got to think, like, back in the '90s, it was unheard of to have a wireless console or even to have a virtual reality at home. There's many, you can go back. There have been many prototypes of it, but they were very finicky or they were very nausea-inducing. And now we have a point where you can just pick up a VR setup for console or computer, and it's just access to everybody. So hopefully you guys enjoy this. Hopefully there's something you learned that you didn't know before. If you guys have any questions or anything you'd like me to talk about next, don't forget to leave a comment, and I will talk to you guys next week.